Hello everybody, this is Mr. Laubach. In this video, we are going to go over the French and Indian War. We are going to talk about the beginning of the war, the Albany Plan of Union, British and colonial victory, the immediate effects of the war, the British view of how the war went, and the colonial view of how the war went. We are also going to talk about Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation of 1763. So the French and Indian War was an extension of an ongoing battle around the world between the French and the British. As a matter of fact, Winston Churchill called the French and Indian War the First World War. In Europe, they referred to the French and Indian War as the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War lasted from 1754 to 1763. The main cause of the war in North America was land, and that land was the Ohio River Valley. From the British point of view, the French provoked the war by building a chain of forts in the Ohio River Valley. One of the reasons the French did so was to halt western growth of British colonies. Hoping to stop the French from completing work at Fort Duquesne, which is now in Pittsburgh, and thereby win control of the Ohio River Valley, the governor of Virginia sent a small militia under the command of a young colonel named George Washington. After gaining a small initial victory, Washington's troops surrendered to a superior force of Frenchmen and their American Indian allies on July 3, 1754. With this military encounter in the wilderness, the French and Indian War began. At first, the war went badly for the British. In 1755, another expedition from Virginia, led by General Edward Braddock, ended in a disastrous defeat, as more than 2,000 regulars, or redcoats, and colonial troops were routed by a small force of French and Indian Americans near Fort Duquesne. The Algonquin allies of the French ravaged the frontier from western Pennsylvania to North Carolina. The French were able to repulse a British invasion of French Canada that began in 1756. The beginning of the war was looking very promising for the French. Recognizing the need for coordinating colonial defense, the British government called for representatives from several colonies to meet in a Congress at Albany, New York in 1754. The delegates from 7 colonies adopted a plan, the Albany Plan of Union, developed for recruiting troops and collecting taxes from the various colonies for their common defense. Each colony was too jealous of its own taxation powers to accept the plan, so the Albany Plan of Union never actually took effect. And the British probably would not have accepted it either, because they would be concerned of such an alliance. The Albany Congress was significant, however, because it set a precedent for later, more revolutionary Congresses in the 1770s. Probably one of the most famous political cartoons in American history, titled Join or Die, was published by Benjamin Franklin, one of the delegates. British victory. The turning point in the war came in 1757, when Prime Minister William Pitt rose to power in the British government. Pitt devised a strategy that focused on capturing French colonial possessions around the world. He poured resources into North America, including a fleet and 25,000 redcoats. He was willing to spend freely for a British victory. Pitt paid all expenses in raising colonial troops. Eventually, 24,000 Americans fought with the British against the French. Faced with such overwhelming force, the French retreated back into Canada. The British followed them there in 1759, and at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13th defeated their main army and captured the city of Quebec. Montreal fell in 1760, completing the British conquest of Canada. After these British victories, the European powers of Britain and France negotiated a peace treaty called the Peace of Paris, or the Treaty of Paris, in 1763. Now, there were other later and earlier treaties of Paris, but the Treaty of 1763 focused on the French and Indian War. Great Britain acquired both French Canada and Spanish Florida. France gave up to Spain its huge western territory, Louisiana, and claims west of the Mississippi River in compensation for Spain's loss of Florida. With this treaty, the British extended their control of North America, and French power on the North American continent was virtually eliminated. Now Great Britain had controlled North America from the eastern seaboard to the Mississippi River. What were the immediate effects of the war? Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, gave them unchallenged supremacy in North America and also established them as the dominant naval power in the world. No longer did the American colonies face the threat of attacks from the French, the Spanish, and the American Indian allies. More important to the colonies, though, was a change in how the British and the colonists viewed each other. The British view. The British came away from the war with a low opinion of colonial military abilities. They held the American militia in contempt as poorly trained and disorganized. Furthermore, they noted that some of the colonies had refused to contribute either troops or money to the war effort. Most British were convinced that the colonists were both unable and unwilling to defend their new frontier on this vastly expanded British Empire. The colonial view. The colonists took an opposite view of their military performance. They were proud of their record in all 4 wars between the British and the French and developed confidence that they could successfully provide for their own defense. They were not impressed with the British troops or their leadership, whose methods of warfare seemed badly suited for densely wooded terrain of Eastern America. More serious than the resentful feeling stirred by the war experience was the British government's shift in its colonial policy. Previously, Britain had exercised little direct control over the colonies and had generally allowed its navigation laws regulating colonial trade to go unenforced. This earlier policy of salutary neglect was abandoned towards the end and after the French and Indian War as the British adopted more forceful policies for taking control of their expanded North American empire. Pontiac's Rebellion. The first major test of the new British imperial policy came in 1763 when Chief Pontiac led a major attack against colonial settlements on the western frontier in the Great Lakes region. The American Indians were angered by the growing westward movement of European settlers onto their land and by the British refusal to offer gifts as the French had done. Pontiac's alliance of American Indians in the Ohio Valley destroyed forts and settlements from New York to Virginia. Rather than relying on colonial forces to retaliate, the British sent regular British troops to put down the uprising. A total of 2,000 people were killed in Pontiac's rebellion. In an effort to stabilize the western frontier, the British government issued a proclamation that prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British hoped that eliminating settlements would prevent future hostilities between colonists and American Indians, like Pontiac's rebellion. But the colonists reacted to the proclamation with anger and defiance. After their victory in the French and Indian War, colonists hoped to reap benefits in the form of access to these western lands. For the British to deny such benefits was infuriating. Defying the prohibition, thousands streamed westward beyond the imaginary boundary line of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation of 1763 was the first of a series of acts by the British government that angered the colonists.